Welcome back. You're listening to the Artificial Intelligence Playbook for Government, sponsored by Data Robot on Federal News Network. I'm your host, Jason Miller. My guests today are Sean Zergis, the Division Chief for Digital Services and Solutions Strategy at the General Services Administration, Dr. Gil Altrovitz, the Director of Artificial Intelligence at the Department of Veterans Affairs, Rear Admiral David Hahn, the Chief of Naval Research at the Department of Navy, and Eric Forsetter, the General Manager for Public Sector at Data Robot. Before break, we were talking about this idea of governance, but before governance, you had to have models and you had to have use cases. And there's some terms here that I think would help to define what they are, so our audience kind of has a level set. So Eric, maybe since you were the one kind of talking a little bit about what these pieces and parts are, well, help me define use case, model, and the like.
Sure, thank you, Jason. Appreciate that. So when we think about a use case could be something like predictive maintenance, or it could be something like fraud. But if you say fraud in the government, there's so many different pieces where you could find fraud. So what you would do is then go to an agency or within the agency and figure out, hey, maybe we want to stop transaction fraud or bad purchase order fraud, something like that. We would then take all the data, run it through a different set of models potentially. In the case of us, we'd run it through hundreds of different models. And from there, we would predict, or we'd be able to pick a model that's the most accurate to predict which purchase order coming into the government was a fraudulent one versus which one is actually a accurate purchase order. So when you think about a model is something where there's code behind it, right, that is predicting something for a use case, and that you've put it then into some type of production, whether it's an end user looking at it to say, yes, this is a fraudulent purchase order, or no, it's not, or it could be something where an application actually just automatically tells it to you. The trick with any of these models is you want to put them under governance, because over time the data that you get is going to change. So today, maybe we've gotten 2 million purchase orders and we know 100,000 of them were fraudulent, so we can predict future fraud on that 100,000. Unfortunately, the data will change over time. Like, fraudsters will get better and will change the type of fraud that they have, so we'll have to change our model, and that's why we need governance over it. The same would apply for predictive maintenance. If you were fixing submarines in the Navy, we may fix an engine at one point, but there may be something that goes wrong with the rudder that would have to change our model as well. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of what we're looking at.
It does. It also helps us level set when we talk through this, because I'm thinking of a model as a strategy or something, but it's almost it sounds like a piece of software, the underlying software.
That's right.
We also talked about use cases, so I want to go down that path a little bit. Let me come back around to Sean. GSA has probably several use cases. I've talked to your CFO several times, and he's talked about a few using RPA, but that's not necessarily AI. So walk me through some of the things you guys are thinking about or starting to do around AI.
Absolutely. So we've got some efforts going both internally and externally. And for GSA, right, that's internal to GSA IT, how we can operate more efficiently, where we can find some of the value in implementing AI and what were traditional processes, procedures, automation, or orchestration. I think orchestration is the best way to put the way we used to try to accomplish tasks. So looking internally, for example, an easy one that everybody tries to run at real quick is virtual bots, right? There's plenty of vendors selling them, plenty of briefings out there. You cut down on the number of pro services hours you're using, answering questions, put the tool right where the customer is, all that user experience improvement approach. One of the challenges we found, of course, is that the back-end data supporting that, there's a lot of human logic in there. It's reference material combined with human logic results in some answer that a customer is seeking, whether it be a trouble ticket, whether it be a vendor inquiry about types of contracts that are available to them, that sort of thing. The biggest challenge we're finding in those kind of use cases is the data cleansing, which I'm sure we'll get around to. But that use case is a very repetitive use case within GSA, because there's constantly that customer agent interaction at all different layers, internally and externally. So we're constantly looking at those pilots and use cases. Internal to GSA, one issue or one use case that I think all security teams struggle with is keeping up with the threats, right? We're getting hit from every possible vector, 24 hours a day, Christmas, New Year's, everything. Using AI and ML to assess all that incoming data that's either getting dropped into Splunk or whatever the repo of choice is, looking at that data as it streams in, doing that analysis, and either orchestrating an action on the back end that otherwise would have taken a human a little bit more time to do, say an hour or two to assess, look at all the criteria, pull up to 2 or 3 different systems that are feeding that data in. It's looking at it based on known criteria, learned formulas from data, that we fed into algorithms and we learned, and then popping out that result almost instantaneously, near real time. That's aside, obviously, from being a pro services save, because we're spending less time on security engineers to accomplish that work, but we're being more reactive and we're staying ahead. So if we're looking at state powers, as the Admiral mentioned, right, we have states attacking the U.S., we need to move faster. And we don't have an army of security engineers out there. There's not 100,000 security engineers in government. But AI/ML is a force multiplier for us, if properly configured and governed, of course.
Of course. Gil, VA has 101 use cases probably. Are you guys into the pilot stage yet?
Yeah, so at the VA, we have got a number of use cases that are being developed, and they're at different stages. So some being piloted, some in production, some kind of being designed. So we're seeing things, everything from automation of form processing for benefits, which we're seeing out there. We're also seeing different areas in terms of, for example, diagnostics, prognostic information. We had an example that was recently developed from research, and that looks at around different areas, for example, predicting cancer from different pathology slides. Examples in medicine where you can predict, for example, acute kidney injury a couple days ahead of time, so thereby preventing the kidney damage from occurring in the first place. So we're seeing it across the VA.
How do you guys prioritize? Because I'm sure that the green field is as long as it is wide, and the Admiral's laughing, so that's your question too, so be prepared.
Yes. Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things, so as an example, in the National Artificial Intelligence Institute, we have a number of use cases that then we present to different stakeholders. That includes veterans, that includes different offices within the VA, and as well as analyzing the costs, and the kind of the risk benefit of each of the use cases. So that's one path. In terms of research and other paths, there are peer-reviewed elements toward research grants that are submitted, and same thing with innovative types of approaches. There are these review processes to go for different use cases.
I can just imagine your desk is piled of requests and use cases and interests, just because it's one of those hot topics right now, without a doubt.
Yes, yeah, it's definitely a hot topic.
David, talk a little about the Navy. You mentioned you had, I think, 17 pilots. Imagine you could probably have 117 or 1,017.
We could, again, a green field, right? So we could go in a lot of different directions and a lot of different projects. But to double tap some of the conversation we've been having here at the table, we face a special challenge, I think, or a little bit of a different challenge, because as in the case of predictive maintenance, which we have some pilots that are moving through getting more uptime on jets, for example, in our naval aviation enterprise. Great results there. We can see both the front end of that problem set and the back end result, right? So that way, this governance of models that we talked about, you can see how they're doing, and you can adjust as you need to continue to be effective or be more effective. One of our challenges that is unique to us, I think, is this notion that we're going to be operating at machine speed, just like Sean talked about, right? With all this stuff inbound to all of our enterprises. But we're going to be doing that in a way where we can't instrument the back end. So we don't understand exactly what it's going to be like when that missile's coming at us, right? So is my sensor system, which has got hundreds of gigabit per second, right, coming in today, and it'll be more in the future. We're very data rich and target poor as we look at the data sets we have to go figure out, is the model right? And then is the model, does it continue to be right as we move across time? So that's one of our special challenges, and each one of these use cases and pilots that I brought up are teasing out pieces and parts of those, and we arrived at the conclusion that they would be a value-add projects through that process I talked about earlier. We spent some time curating the problem so it was narrow enough that we could understand it and do something about it. Then we triaged the set of tools that were readily available to us, so we knew we had one that could apply in that area. And then we looked at what's the lift, right? And is the data good enough to apply that tool today to get at some kind of results again in the near term. So that's been our process. We continue to modify that as we move through time. It's been successful to date. We'll see as we go forward.
All right, Eric, jump in.
Yeah, so one thing just to add on what the Admiral was saying and also what Sean was saying is when you look at this, you have to come up with a success plan, and it's really, really important. We're fortunate at DataRobot. We have 300 of the top data scientists in the world who've won things from Kaggle competitions, which is a survival of the fittest, who's the best data scientist for a given set. And what we do is we've been enabling these agencies and helping them to better understand which problems can they solve quickly, right? And which are going to give them high impact, good value right away. But it's also figuring out like which ones have known outcomes, which ones are maybe doing anomaly detections, like in the cyber case where we know certain things are happening and then there's other things we don't know about as well. And we're working with some great agencies, from the cyber perspective as well. But I think the big thing is, back to the Admiral's point, is you really have to go down and define these and figure out which ones are going to give us the right impact, but which one do we have data ready today that we can do? Because they make mission critical things. Like if a missile is coming at you, you want to make sure that model is working. And even for the VA, if you have a patient in the hospital, we want to make sure we're making a decision that impacts life or death with as much accuracy as possible.
That data piece I think is key, and I think it's a great segue. Sean, walk me through a little bit about how GSA is looking at your data. Are there steps you're taking to say, what is the 80% solution? Because 100% I don't think is possible ever.
Absolutely. So stick to with what you can attain, right? And going back to targeting use cases, right? Part of targeting those use cases are looking at where the environment is more suited or best suited to move towards AI ML. And part of that is data, and I don't think we call it generally data scrubbing anymore. I think that scares people. Unfortunately, that may be a little bit more indicative to the level of effort, right? Because we're leaning heavily on our data stewards to go back and clean up their data in such a way that it can be consumed by an ML algorithm, so to speak. But on the plus side, right, we've been doing this for a while. Data analytics and tools in GSA, D2D, data to decisions, those kind of efforts have been in place for a decade plus now. So we're not just now starting to move towards there. Thankfully, that effort, aligning those resources, training those data scientists, creating the guidebooks and playbooks for data stewards to kind of move in that direction already, that's already in place, and we have that momentum, which is terrific for AI ML. Part of targeting which use cases best align, obviously a big factor is how's your data look? And
right.
Chatbot was a perfect one. We sat with business, we looked back, we looked at the data they had, just wasn't suitable. We looked at the level of effort, that's going to get kicked to the right a little bit. Another use case, data cleansing specific, is our end user licensing agreement. This is a use case that replicates across the board in multiple different deliverable types and artifacts that the government has to process and work with industry for. We need to look at a document, a PDF or whatnot, determine if the contents of it comply with some regulatory guidance, whether it be 508 compliance or similar. These tools are capable of doing that, but the data we use for the initial learning either doesn't exist or it's not cleaned up well enough. So that's a huge effort. We're absolutely not trying to do this in a waterfall method. We're not stopping all pilots and prototypes until people clean up their data, right? It's part of that, which it's a target-rich environment, I think somebody mentioned, which is absolutely true. There's lots of potential use cases in all of these agencies. So we want to focus on which ones we can be successful at first.
And Gil, in many ways, when you have a pilot or a use case and the data is not so clean, people get really motivated to clean it because they start to see that potential. Oh, well, what if we got that data right? Look what we can do. Are you guys, because VA, again, tons of data.
Right. So there's a lot in that. So we're looking at a couple of different innovative ways to look at the data sets and learn from the different potential partners as well. So for example, a few months ago, we had the AI Tech Sprint, in which we put together some small data sets that were a little bit more open, and we're able to work with a number of different organizations that together analyzed that data for tools that they were building. And in doing so, they were able to find not only and create new tools, but they were able to give us feedback on those data sets. And that's what was really interesting in that, because for different use cases, you need different types of data. You have to have it be basically AI-able data, suitable for AI for the different types of use cases. And so what we did is we, in working with and understanding how the partners were creating those tools from the data, we learned for those use cases how the data might be improved when it is created in the future.
David, one of the things about the Navy, again, with data-rich environment, or do you guys have a process by which you are picking use cases, looking at the data, and then what's the next step? Okay, we're ready, we're not quite ready. To be ready, we need a month, we need 6 months, we need 6 years.
I wish it was that simple. So a couple things to just toss out here. I do think that when folks see that if their data is appropriately stewarded, they do get excited, because now they can see what can I do with that, especially when I can combine that data set with that data set. All of a sudden, your head just starts to explode with possibilities. So that's great that we're exposing that to folks and they can see it. The challenges that we have, again, lots of data, lots of origination of data, be it sensor systems or decision systems across a spectrum of applications. Where does that data go? Who retains that data? Who has access to that data? We talk about data as if it was just in this, there's a data ocean, a data lake, a data pond. Sure, we have classification levels that we have to deal with. We have data rights issues that we in government have to deal with when we contract for a product. And so we have to work our way through all of that to get to a place where the data that the Navy needs to do their job, to do its job, is available. We have great examples of that in some instances that have been going on for decades. I'm sure you're familiar, everybody's familiar with the hurricane tracking system that tells you where your hurricane's going. That's a result, a direct result of the Navy's interest in weather, because weather affects ships at sea.
Just a little.
And we care about that. So we need to get out of the way of those storms, understand where they're coming so we can be fully prepared. So for decades, we have been involved with significant models, high performance computing, the application of algorithms to help improve those models so we can predict the weather. And that's this continuous integration, continuous delivery set of things that applies not just to the Navy, but it applies to the civilian population, because many of those models used by the weather guessers today come from us. So we have great experience doing this, but we have not applied it across all the domains where it would apply.
All right.
Thanks.
You brought up something very important, data access, and as well as classification and where the data goes. We're going to probably hit upon that in the next segment, so let's take a quick break. You're listening to the discussion, the Artificial Intelligence Playbook for Government, sponsored by Data Robot on Federal News Network.